Yeah. Okay, so the first thing I kind of just wanted to get a rundown on with everyone was just the order of cross sexes. So it starts out with the cross sex of the 1AC, and then the 1A is going to be answering that, and then the 2N's doing the cross sexing, and then it's the cross sex of the 1NC where the 1A is doing the cross sexing, and then it's the cross sex of the 2AC where the 1N is doing the cross sexing, and then the cross sex of the 2NC where the 2A is doing the cross sexing. So a big part of cross-sex isn't just kind of having these gotcha moments, but how it can really implicate your chances of winning a debate. And also, it is important to always have those moments that can help boost your speaker points that can, of course, affect your chances in elim rounds. So, in terms of actually doing well in the debates and getting the ballots, a big part of it is getting links to the arguments you're going to be making. So, the first big one, especially against an AF that you might not be as prepared to debate, is getting links to critique. So you can ask about things like justifications behind the plan, why they presented certain things the way they did. So, for example, if a nuclear war or an extinction impact is read, you can ask them questions like, why was that read? And not all of it has to be kind of a concrete answer that you want them to give, although that's always good to have. But sometimes it's just kind of good to see where it goes so you can kind of talk more about that. Or if you're a little kind of confused about how you think they're going to try and use one impact to respond to your critique, then it's also good to talk about that. Um, Also for DAs. So, for example, if you want to read your politics DA, but it's unclear whether the AF is done through the executive or the courts or the Congress, then that's always something you should ask about, even though that's obviously not exactly going to be like a really good moment for you or anything like that. It's going to be, but it's strategic and it's necessary. It's something you need to do. So if you want to read your agenda DA, you need to make sure that the AF is Congress. If you want to read your courts DA, judicial budgets, sua sponte, whatever, you need to ask about the agent, you need to ask about the actor of the plan. And even if you think that's clear based on 1AC evidence, a lot of the times it's still valuable to ask in cross ex, especially because that's when the judge is going to be paying the most attention and everyone's going to be talking slow and it's easy. Besides dissats and critiques, it can also be helpful for counterplan based stuff. So, for example, counterplan competition. This is obviously iffy because of the debate about positional competition. So whether or not if I say in cross-ex I'm the courts, does a counterplan that competes off of that compete? Like there's a debate to be had about that. But it's still important, even if you're not going for a full counterplan base that is competing off of what someone said in cross-ex, it's still good to kind of know that for the context of counterplan competition. Also, some counterplans just don't make much sense if the actor is Congress or the court. So if you're reading a counterplan to like sue the executive or something like that, and the AF is the executive, then it wouldn't make much sense, especially if the AF has an executive key warrant. And as the negative, that's also an important part to get that down. So if you really want to go for a counterplan that competes off of that, and you think that the AF isn't going to be going for a competition-based argument, then it's good to know what the AF is probably going to say in response to that. So the AF is like, oh well, the reason we're the courts, and the reason is the courts are needed to have a strong perception of policy stability within the United States. But that's good to know prior to the one and C if you're going to be reading a counterplan based on that, or at least so you can start thinking about that for future speeches. The other thing is internal links. So cross-sexing about that is always really important, i.e., why does the AF solve? Why does X cause Y? Because you can always counterplan to do something like that. So if the 1AC seems like they have really robust impacts, or you're not sure where you don't have impact defense to 3 out of 6 of the AF impacts or something like that, internal links are the place to go because it's likely that the AF either doesn't solve them or a counterplan could solve them. So it's good to talk about why the AF is key in cross-sex, and that's also parts where you can point out some of the logical flaws of the plan, i.e., why is the AF the only thing that can resolve warming? What about these other strategies? And you can even ask about them. Maybe you don't want to tip your hand too much, but in cross-sex of the 1AC, you can be like, okay, well, you've said that we need a carbon tax to resolve all these things. Why can't we do like a geoengineering based strategy? And it's important also not to get too bogged down in the specific details, but kind of just getting a general idea, both for you, but also more importantly for the judge. So that's you want to be trying to persuade the judge. So during these cross-sects, you don't want to be looking at your opponent. You want to be looking at the judge, because even though this is a time for things like clarification as well. It's also a time for you to be persuading the judge. Okay, so this was a cross-sex. I'm just going to come back to this at the end if we have more time. But the kind of what happened here was there was an AF team from Kansas versus the NEG from Wake Forest, and the AF was cross-sex. The AF read an AF to alter agricultural subsidies, and the NEG was asking about the position in which the plan took. And it didn't end up actually going that far, and obviously it was the final, so it was an elim round in which it didn't really, speaker points weren't relevant, but it was really important for kind of getting the idea of the AF across. So what you should take from this, if we do end up watching it, or if we don't, is that A, it's important for persuading the judges, and B, it's important for you understanding the AF, both of which are crucial in winning the round. So in the context of AF strategy, when you're answering questions in 1AC cross-sex, it's important for two main things. First is clarification. So if you're reading a very complex AF with sort of convoluted internal links, or maybe a confusing process that you don't think the judge will understand, then that's your time to get that across, because it's important to have these kind of convoluted mechanisms so the other team gets confused, because obviously that's going to help you win. But when it's too confusing to the point where the judge doesn't understand it, that's when it becomes problematic. So taking the time, and sometimes you can even tell your opponents if they're trying to cut you off or something like that, be like, no, it's important I explain this, and then kind of just talk it through. Or even tying it back. If they're asking about your internal links and you're like, well, this comes back to the first question you asked me, and then kind of explaining the mechanism of the AF, that's a really important thing to both convey to the judge and convey to the other team. Because if the other team's confused, like, of course, that's helpful to an extent because it'll alter their strategy. But it's also problematic because if they're just saying something that's so non-responsive, that might confuse the judge, and you might just lose the round because the judge has no clue what's going on. So cross-sexing the 1NC. It's important to point out logical inconsistencies. Not all of these things are going to be that blatant, but for example, if they read a DA about sustaining military spending, like the NDAA politics DA that was read earlier this year, and then hedge bad, that's a contradiction. And obviously that's like very blatant. And sometimes it might be a little more subtle. So for example, let's say they do read a DA about the internet, right? Let's say they say the plane collapses the internet. And then they read a K about capitalism or something of that sort. And you can cross-sex them and be like, well, internet, as per your impact evidence, is key to resolving some of these things that you've also said sustain capitalism. How do you reconcile the two? Or don't even make it that blatant sometimes, but just kind of bring it to their attention and see what they have to say. And again, not all of these are going to be round-winning things, but part of it is just pointing out logical flaws in their strategy that can kind of help the judge to be more sympathetic, especially when you're answering it, even if you're not going to go for like performative contradictions or reasons to reject the team. It's also important to identify what's relevant. So if you're cross-sexing them about some counterplan and they keep coming back to one thing or one part of the counterplan or maybe a competition question or something like that, that's also important. You should try and get them to, not let them talk about that the whole time. But if like every time you ask a question about this one counterplan, they're just like, and like they're kind of unsure what it's about, and then you ask a question about another counterplan and they're just like, okay, here's what it does, here's how it competes, here's how it solves, here's the net benefit, etc., then you probably need to be more worried about the latter than the former. And again, sometimes negs will try and trick you with that kind of stuff, but it's often more useful than it's not. So 2AC cross-sex. This is parts where you can kind of make offensive points in the debate. So this is also kind of the same as 1AC cross-sex, but if they've read some sort of advantage-based counterplan that's trying to solve the internal links of the AF, or if you know you're going to go for an impact turn to a net benefit, that's your time to get offensive points in the debate strat around like what basically get into your playing field. So centering your answers based on what you want to go for rather than what they want to go for. So if 1NC cross-sex, you were cross-sexing about the commission's counterplan, and every answer they gave was like, okay, here's why the counterplan competes. And they're just like destroying you on this. You're like, yeah, the counterplan totally competes. But you want to go for an argument about how it polarizes the AF or something, or sends a less credible signal to investors, something along the lines of that, then that's what you need to talk about. So this is the time to get it back in your playing field. And again, I'll talk about this more later, but they're going to probably try and detract from that, and you need to stay on point. So cross-sex of the 2NC. Just the first example is just on the K. A lot of time, but definitely not just the K, also like process counterplan competition blocks. So when the 2NC was 8 minutes of reading down blocks as fast as the neg could, then that's your point to exploit that, because a lot of what's being said is nonsense. But if you drop it, you're going to lose the debate, especially if you have a judge that's, really tech over truth or really kind of into some of the arguments that 2N was making. But if you point out that it's nonsense and cross-ex, that kind of gets you to think about it more so you can identify it in relevant speeches. And B, it gets the judge to think about it and maybe will err a little more af, even if the 1AR is, let's say, the 2NC subpoints your framework blocks with like 16 things, and you're just like, okay, you said process counterplans are an alt cause or something like that you think is silly. That's your time to point that out, and that way the 1AR both gets a little leeway, and you've kind of told the judge, look, this doesn't really make that much sense. It also can kind of center around like what they think is responsive and what really isn't, but the judge might not. So this is kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier. But if you have, like, let's say, a really confusing deficit to some counterplan because of a political mechanism that the plan does that the 2N obviously doesn't understand and the judge looks confused about, this as well as 1AC cross-ex is kind of your time to be like, look, this is what the AF does. You said that the counterplan does this. How does it solve, or how does it compete? And just kind of talking about these things that you know that you're right about, but you don't think that the judge will or the other team will, and that might make the debate more confusing. So cross-ex of the 2AC and the 2NC. When you're the one doing that cross-ex, that's by far the hardest because a lot of the relevant questions have already been set up. So things like who does the AF, right? That's a traditional first question to kind of both establish links to the politics of the courts dissad that I was talking about, and also sometimes competition in some instances, or at least making it relevant to the counterplan, right? So once those have been resolved, it kind of like everyone has like a general idea of what the AF does and what the next strategy is, then the judge is oftentimes going to be a little bit tuned out for 2AC and 2NC cross-ex. And even your opponent might be, the person who's being cross-exed, or you might be too. So the kind of important things are making it engaging. You really don't want the judge to tune out because this cross-ex can be really valuable, especially because what we were talking about on the last slide about things on like, they just read like 8 minutes of nonsense and exploiting this and making the judge think about that, right? Because when the judge is thinking about your arguments during like prep time, their speech time, even cross-ex, that's what you want. The other important thing, this isn't just for 2AC and 2NC cross-ex, but it's making it relevant. So you want to communicate with your partner. There's been times where me and my partner haven't talked about that enough, and I spent 3 minutes asking in one cross-ex about this deficit, and my partner's like, we're not going to go for that deficit. We're going to go for this competition argument and impact defense or something like that. So talking with your partner and saying, okay, the 1AR is going to go for the certainty deficit and perm do both and net benefit internal link defense, as opposed to, and then you might have just screwed up the whole cross-ex by asking about the wrong thing. So talking about with your partner, and even your partner might be able to help. So tag team cross-ex when, both you and your partner are asking questions and the other two are answering. That's not ideal because there's a reason that cross-exes are the way they are, right? Like the reason that the 1A isn't cross-sexing the 2NC is because the 1A should be prepping the 1AR during the 2NC cross-ex. But, the 1A obviously is in the debate still. The 2NC cross-ex is relevant for their ability to win the debate. So talking to the 1A, and even if the 1A needs to clarify a question, let's say the 1A didn't hear what subpoint 3 was on the competition argument, or if the 1A is just like, this argument doesn't make much sense, and either telling the 2A to point it out or just asking it themselves, that can always be valuable. So some general cross-ex tips are what to do when you're unsure of the answer. So let's say, this is the first time you've just broken new AF, or this is early in the season, you're unsure of what the AF does, or it's just not completely clear. They ask a confusing question, something like that. That happens inevitably even to the best debaters because, not everyone knows everything. So when you're unsure of the answer, there's a few things you can do. You can kind of go back in evidence. That's I think the most important one because, obviously certain exceptions, like if it's a competition argument, you probably didn't read 3 cards on it, like perm other issues or textual functional competition. But if you're being cross-exed in the 1AC about a way in which the plan's done, or let's say you just like completely blanked out and you don't know who does the plan, refer to evidence. And that doesn't mean that you should, be staring at your evidence and being like, this card says X, Y, Z, and just verbatim read lines from your evidence. But it does mean that you should absolutely reference it. The second thing is you can always try and clarify. So that's less ideal and might result in a minimal reduction of speaker points, but it's good to kind of talk about that. And you can make that relevant about like what, like, you don't know exactly what they said, ask them. And again, not ideal, but sometimes it's something that has to be done. What if you don't know what to ask? So again, a lot of times in cross-sects of the 2NC, that's the later cross-sects are harder, or even in the 1NC. Let's say you're a 1A and you are helping your 2A prep because it was a really big 1NC and you just didn't know what to do, right? That can be a time where you kind of figure that out. So you can either during the 1NC be thinking about that. But so the two kind of important things are make sure you're not out of questions, right? So before the cross-sects, you know you're going to be doing the cross-sects. So maybe take a minute even. That I mean, usually more, but if you're really time pressed, just take a minute and figure out what you want to talk about. Even take like 20 seconds, ask your partner, be like, okay, what do you like? What are we going to do against this new counter plan? I have no clue how to answer it. Your partner's like, okay, I think this is the problem, and just ask them about it. So that's something that you can do. There's always situations if you're debating a new app where you can just take cross-sects as prep time, although that's ideal. I can talk about that more in a little bit, but in general, you should always try and use all of your cross-sects unless there are significant. There are exceptions, but unless there are extenuating circumstances. So how do you respectfully cut off your opponents? That's also what I was talking about a little bit earlier. But a lot of times in the cross-sects, you have 3 minutes, right? And let's say you're the 2 and you're cross-sexing the 1A. You have no clue what the AF does, and you just like the 1NC, like you're cooked, right? You don't know what you're gonna do. So you can kind of your opponent's just rambling. You're like, who does the plan? And they're like, oh, normal means is Congress, and then they start talking about that, and you're like, no, I just wanted to know who does the plan. So part of it's not being super forceful, right? But you need to be a little bit. So there's a line between being aggressive and like telling them to shut up or something, and being like, okay, that makes sense. Let's move on, right? And just kind of doing that respectfully. Um, but again, firmness is important because if you let the other person talk over you for 2 minutes of cross-sects, then that's a lot of strategic bandwidth that's gone. Um, so conciseness and confidence are also really important. So if you're asking a question, right, let's say there was like just like 5 sentences of counterplan text and it's just like so confusing. Don't read the whole counterplan text in cross-sects or ask questions that are like, oh, you said this and this and this and this and this, so why isn't this and this and this true? Because the judge is going to tune out, right? The judge is probably not like that interested in being there. So if you're asking really long, really confusing questions, the judge is probably going to tune out. And to be honest, the other team is probably just going to be like, could you repeat that, please? Or like, could you phrase that in another way or something? Because like they probably weren't listening either. So part of it is just making your questions more concise. And again, that's something that can be both figured out before the round or during your prep time or during their speech time. And also something that just kind of takes practice. But that's something that needs to be focused on and something you kind of need to like place an emphasis on, because if those questions are too long, that's when it becomes like they're kind of irrelevant, even if you're asking the smartest question ever. The other one is confidence. So if you're answering a question about the 1AC and you know what the 1AC does, but the 2N was just like really forceful, and you think the 2N is like super smart, and they're just like, well, you said this, so why doesn't that take out your internal link or something? And you're just like, maybe it does. Like part of it's being like, you need to be confident about it, because if you portray that you're not confident, then the judge can see that, and then the judge can kind of be like, maybe they're wrong, because if the 1A isn't, if in the 1AC cross-sects, the 1A and the 2A, presumably if the 2A needed to step in, don't really know what the AF does, maybe this internal link is like wrong or something like that. So again, you might be wrong in some instances, but being confidently wrong isn't the best thing, but kind of confidently making smart applications. So you probably spent a long time thinking about the AF, certainly more than the 2N did, or at least that's probably where you should be in the debate. So you probably know more about the AF. So sometimes you can even take a second to think. And if it's like a really complex question, you can be like, just give me a second, give me like 2 seconds to think about that or something like that. Or just be like, and like think about it and be like, okay, well then here's what we have to say. And kind of showing that you're engaged in that cross-sects is what's really important. Then the last thing I have to say is just make it relevant. Again, we kind of talked about that a little bit on the 2AC and 2NC cross-sects. But if you're cross-sexing about like some off that they're like, let's say the 1NC was 12 off and there was T subsets or T and or something like that, or the 1-card death K. I mean, of course, there's exceptions. Maybe this team is going for the 1-card death K every round, but it's likely that there's something more substantial in the 1NC, or something like, let's say they've gone for the multilateralism counterplan every round, and you just spent 3 minutes of cross-sects about T subsets. I mean, first of all, that's probably going to be a little bit boring for the judge, but also more importantly, that's not going to help you win the debate. So you need to both make it engaging for the judge and make it relevant for you in terms of winning the debate. Okay. Are there any questions?